Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sean, are we on 6th?
6.
This is our 6th episode with one of my absolutely most favorite people in the world. Ralph's joining us today for the Furloughed Network. Ralph, who is joining us, not only is he my life coach and executive coach during my program at Villanova, but he is an educator, researcher, speaker, and consultant. Ralph's currently the director of the Center for Organizational Leadership at Rutgers, Go Big Ten. He provides leadership programs, overall planning, delivery, and assessment of signature programs and services at Rutgers, and author of multiple books, including Crisis Leadership in Higher Education. And so excited to have Ralph here joining us today. So thanks, Ralph, for joining us.
Thanks to you both.
We are so excited to have you. And kind of what Sean and I wanted to focus on today is talking a little bit about higher education, which is Ralph's space, but also talking about leadership, thinking about yourself during crisis as a leadership. How are you reinventing yourself as you come out of this? So we're just so excited to kind of dive in with Ralph today and talk about some of those topics on our call. So thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you,
All
guys.
right. Before we jump into the good stuff, we always want to kick off, and we wanted to ask everybody on the call, what is one of your greatest accomplishments you've had during this quarantine period? So Ralph, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, we were just talking about this before recording the call, that my daughter arrived on March 19th. So my baby, my third child, was born March 19th. So she has been like a beacon of light in this really dark time. But what's been most remarkable about it is I've had a bunch of different webinars and podcasts, and with 3 small kids downstairs, they have not interrupted any of them yet with loud screaming or breaking through the door. So I'm hoping that will continue in the minutes to follow here.
I gotta learn your secret to that. That's impossible. I'm calling BS, so that is impossible. My son was 10 for 10 on Tuesday. 10 for 10. Yeah, I mean, he was batting 1,000, and I really gave it to him. I thought he was going to forget about the 9th and 10th, but no, he stuck his head in and offered me a Quaker oat bar while I was in the middle of talking to people. So that's impressive, man.
Wait, so Ralph, how was it having a quarantine baby? Were you in the room? Could you be there? Like, how was
it? It was scary leading up to it, especially for my wife, because, March 19th, that was when things were really starting to get very serious. I was able to go to the hospital, but we were not allowed to have any visitors. I was, tested going into the hospital and just checked and asked a lot of questions. But I've heard from friends who are about to have babies in the next couple of weeks that there are even some restrictions on spouses or partners being in the delivery room with them. So it's very serious. But I think the eerie part about it, Lauren, too, was that I was in the hospital room, watching the news coverage, holding the baby, and you just heard the ambulances outside because things were just getting really severe, and they were setting up one of the drive-through testing sites right outside of the hospital. So it was weird. It was definitely unlike having my past 2 kids.
Yeah. Well, she's here, and she's so cute.
Thank you.
Hold on. There she is.
Oh, that's her.
Little nugget. God. There she is.
So cute.
Beautiful angel. So we're so happy here.
That's awesome, man. Congratulations.
Sean, what about you?
The greatest accomplishments as this all started.
Since 14.
Maybe a little self-serving, but I think this is kind of cool. I think that what you and I put together here is pretty cool. It's a pretty cool accomplishment. It's just one of those things that work is work and family is family, but it's like kind of cool that you and I started doing something that I think will hopefully help people, even if it's just a few people. It's something that we did. So I'll go with that.
Yeah, I love it too. And I think for me, definitely getting through 2nd semester of school, we had to completely transform Villanova's program to go virtual for my second half of my modular for my EMBA. So having to transfer that and do well, which was great. So now I'm done that one, getting ready to go summer, which will be 100% online too, which I'm excited to talk about Ralph with higher education. So I'm getting ready to kind of convert. I used to go every weekend to the Inn at Villanova every 3 weeks, and now I'm going 100% online. So I think converting to that, and I think the furlough network too, like I wouldn't have been able to figure out the unemployment thing without this community we built. So it's been nice to have this community to lean on during these really uncertain times that I'm especially going through during furlough. So I think that's been a huge accomplishment as well. So it's been awesome.
Okay.
So Ralph, when we want to kick it off, what is going on with higher education? What are the conversations you're hearing and that you're a part of? We'd love to get some insight from you on that, because I think there's so much unknown right now when it comes to the education system and what it's going to look like.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. It's higher education itself was facing a whole bunch of issues pre-COVID. Issues, especially in the Northeast and other regions of the country, with declining enrollment or trends that were predicting that we would have a smaller pool of traditional undergraduate students. Budgetary issues with a funding model that might not be all that sustainable in the long term. So there were a lot of funding issues, especially for some small private universities and small public universities, especially regional public universities. And I think the third piece was just growing distrust around the value of higher education. Mm-hmm. So is higher education a place where you grow intellectually and form a network? Is it just meant to be a place for job training and job preparation? So what's the purpose of higher education? And it became very political. So lots of studies were coming out looking at political preferences and increased distrust around the value of higher education. This was all pre-COVID. Mm-hmm. So higher ed leaders were dealing with lots of issues related to those three topics and others. And in so many ways, this crisis has just complicated the work of higher education leadership. It has made the kinds of things that we focus on in our programs and in leadership development initiatives all the more important. And I think it's accelerated some of the trends that were already underway. I think we're going to see a shift towards a broader infrastructure for online learning. We're going to see more entrepreneurial approaches to the kinds of programs we're putting out there and the ways in which we're attracting students to the programs. And I also think it's going to lead all of us to think about what is the purpose of higher education. One other point to this too, if you look at the ways in which institutions have responded to the crisis, there is so much to take pride in for how higher ed has responded to it. We were some of the first institutions to become engaged in social distancing, and we responded pretty quickly to the crisis. It'll be interesting to see how we respond to it in the months to follow.
Yeah. So Ralph, has Rutgers made any decisions on what they're doing for summer programs or fall yet, or is everything pretty kind of keeping it quiet for right now?
Yes. So summer is fully online. So all of the programs are fully online, and there are restrictions for in-person gatherings. Nothing has been announced yet formally about the fall. I know that there are teams meeting to map out a plan. Lots of other institutions have responded and put out messaging around their firm plans for the fall. An interesting model just came out a couple of days ago from Notre Dame and a few other schools that are going to be starting 2 weeks earlier in August, not taking a fall break, and then wrapping up the in-person part of the program before Thanksgiving, and then being done until the new semester, with the thought that you can still have a cohesive in-person experience for anyone that's able to participate, and then also have students leave the campus before a second wave of the virus might take hold in the later stages of the fall. So it's an interesting model, and lots of other models out there.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So Ralph, in your book, Crisis Leadership in Higher Education, what are some of the tips that you're providing leaders today about how they should be leading during this crisis?
Yeah. So I did, for that book, talk to a lot of senior leaders across higher education, across the country, and try to distill what are some of the key ingredients for effective crisis leadership. A few that emerged from that work. One, you need to have sort of that short-term triage approach where you're fixing and addressing the issues in front of you, while also being mindful of the long-term impact and implications for where you're taking the organization. So trying to balance the short-term focus and the long-term focus. I think a second thing that's really important, when crises strike, there's the tendency to focus almost immediately on the impact this is going to have on our reputation, our personal reputations, and on our collective reputations. And if your goal as a leader is just to preserve the reputation, you might engage in communication practices that don't serve you well in the long term, because you're just trying to spin your way out of the mess that's in front of you. Mm-hmm. But by actively thinking about what those core values are for you as an individual, as a leader, and for the institutions that you work for, and to let those values drive the decisions that you make. If those are the anchor that you use to inform how you handle those kinds of situations, it might create some issues in the short term because you might not react in ways that are agreeable to so many different stakeholders. But in the long term, it really will serve you well.
But so do you think,
yeah.
Sorry, Ralph, I didn't cut you off, but just on that point, do you think that leaders currently haven't had that same issue of possibly worried about reputation and spinning their way out of it? Since the crisis is so ubiquitous, you would almost feel like there's no way to spin your way out of it.
That's such a great observation, Sean. I did nowhere in the book did I mention pandemic, and the book was published in 2019. Yeah, so just a few months before all this happened. And yes, this crisis is unlike anything we've experienced in higher education, especially because it has been ubiquitous and pervasive and has impacted all of us, all across higher education. So yeah, I think the immediate response, we just sort of looked around and did what everyone else was doing because it became clear that that's what we needed to do. I think where the reputation piece is going to get tricky is in the months to follow. As we start to see different universities responding to opening up in the fall in person, what does it mean if our neighboring institution opens up in person? We don't feel comfortable doing it. I think it's going to become an increasingly more important topic in the weeks ahead.
Yeah. And Ralph, how are you talking about communication with leaders right now? So I think that's so important. So from like leadership around during this furlough period, I'm trying to hear what's going on with the organization, communication from leadership, but just this unknown time, how are you communicating or changing your communication strategies during this crisis to really keep your employees at ease and kind of help them through this uncertain time?
I think it's a really interesting observation, Lauren, and communication's critical to one's success as a leader. And I think there's so much uncertainty that we're dealing with right now. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety. And I know many of your audience members for this podcast and the website probably are scared, right? When will their employer get back to normal? What does normal look like? Am I in the right career? And I think when you think about the dynamics of leadership communication, being open and transparent are really key. And even if you can't say everything, say what you're able to say, and to let people know when you'll get back to them with more information is really important. Having a central repository for messaging so you can go to the one place that's a trusted source to access this information. And lastly, don't lose sight of the humanity and grace that's needed to deal with these really difficult situations. We're in this together in lots of ways. And I know organizations have to make some really difficult decisions in the months to follow. People are impacted by the decisions that you make, and lives are impacted by this. So treat people with grace and with dignity and respect.
Yeah.
Ralph, real quick, for us people that are quote unquote aspiring leaders, like we have a lot of the characteristics, we have a lot of the aspirations, we're willing to put in the hard work, the whole thing, but we're not at that objective leader level yet. What could we do? I don't want this to feel like we're trying to exploit the crisis, but what could we do now to demonstrate that we can lead in a crisis?
Oh, that's another interesting question. When we talk about leadership and some of the writing that we've done at Rutgers, we talk a lot about leadership as a process of social influence. And by that, leadership isn't limited to one's position, but it's more about the process and way in which you engage with others and influence others. So from that perspective, leadership is formal, but it's also informal. So to think about the ways in which you can engage in informal leadership by doing any number of tasks. One, creating a furlough network website in the interim to demonstrate capacity and capability and your willingness to want to support other people is a really big example, but an important example of what you can do to build a brand, to support other people, to put the work in that's necessary to show that you are committed to completing a task. And I think showing up and volunteering and networking actively and trying as best as you can to stay positive and confident and committed. I think all of that will go a long way.
Yeah. And Ralph, as we're starting to transition back, we're seeing some states are opening, some people are starting to go back to work, things are starting to reopen. How do we start to transition how we're thinking about ourselves as a leader as we come out of this? Because I think we all know the new normal is not going to look the same. Right. So how do we start to think about that transition period too?
One of the early views of crisis, it's actually one of there's some debate around it, but a Chinese translation of the word crisis is that it's a dangerous opportunity, dangerous opportunity. And I think that definition and that perspective sheds a lot of light on sort of how you engage in reinvention in the aftermath of crisis, right? There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a new normal that we're all going to be entering. Some of us are entering it now, and others will be in the weeks to follow. To think carefully about what are our values, what are our goals, what do we intend to do, and to step into it with that grace and with that humility and with that willingness to learn. If we can support one another and if we're willing to learn, I think we will get through this together. And I think it will build some goodwill for us and for others as we sort of together make sense of this really, really odd and unsettling situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, Ralph, should we be thinking about reinventing ourselves? Because I think I'm a different person coming out of this. Like I've learned a lot during this furlough down time, but personal values, core values, things that I'm looking for, things that I'm going to need from the team going back, I think are going to be different coming out of this.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I'm sure it depends on the person and his or her circumstances, but there's no doubt that self-awareness and self-reflection were critical for effective leadership before this crisis. I think as we think about what the organization, what will the contemporary workplace look like on the other side of this in higher ed or broader, it's going to require some real careful self-monitoring and real careful self-awareness around like, where are we taking our careers? In what ways did we bond with our families during this really intimate time with one another that revealed things to us that maybe we didn't take seriously before the crisis, right? It's taught us all a lot. We all come at it from different circumstances. So if it's inventing yourself, reinventing yourself, being more reflective around who you are and who you want to be, or just being more aware of how you show up as a leader, I think there's a lot of that can help inform our ways of being in the aftermath of the crisis, for sure.
And Ralph, would you have any suggestions for the viewers who are thinking about like, hey, how do I take some time for reflection during this period? Like any tips or tricks that you would have with them of things that they can be doing to like take this downtime, but to use it for reflection or helping you to kind of move forward to the new normal?
Yeah. I can share what I encourage the folks that I'm coaching or the folks I'm working with at the university to do. And I've been trying to do this myself as well. Carve out dedicated time for it. And especially if you have kids or pets or siblings or parents or whomever, there are lots of distractions, and I get it. So carve out time when you feel like you'll be able to focus. Doesn't have to be a lot of time, to begin with your goals and to begin with your values and to make sure that there's alignment between the two, and to make sure that those goals and those priorities have some actionable items next to them. So if your goal is to explore new career opportunities, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 things you can do to make sure that you're making progress on that particular goal? And again, to make sure that those goals align with who you say you are and who you want to be. So to make sure there's alignment across them. And to post them somewhere where you'll see it. I know if you saw my desk right now, I have this nice clean wall behind me. If you looked at my desk, it's not so clean and orderly. To like post it somewhere where you're going to look at it and not lose it, and a kid isn't going to take it. You're not going to spill coffee on it. So you can focus on it. It's a continual reminder of what it is you're striving to do.
Ralph, these are all really, really good tips. I feel like I could just keep asking you questions for the next like 2 hours. But unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. We try to keep the under a half hour. But as we part ways, and I don't think we prepped you on this, so I'll put you on your toes and see how it works. But we like to end these with the same question, and that is, what have you seen recently or experienced recently? Let's put the birth of your daughter aside. That's going to be too obvious. What have you seen or experienced recently that's motivated you, made you optimistic for our future?
Oh man, So I think I've seen so many of the news stories and read so many of the news stories that you guys have read. You see people on balconies in Italy singing together, even though they're physically distanced from one another, but still emotionally connected. I've seen colleagues at Rutgers and across higher education serving on the front lines of trying to develop a saliva test and engage in some real critical thinking about our purpose and how we're going to do the work we need to do. And I think there's been just walking around my neighborhood, people saying hi to one another from a distance that we probably would have overlooked before all of this. There is incredible hope that we'll get through this together. And I think we're social beings, and this has been really deeply unsettling for us because we've had to be physically distant from one another. But I think the emotional connections that we've seen and what that might teach us for moving forward, that we need one another, is really, really encouraging.
Yeah. And Ralph, before we wrap up, will Iowa play Rutgers this year?
If you go to NJ.com right now, there is a story about Rutgers football, and I'll just lead you to that story without commenting on it. I don't know.
All right. Go Hawks, Ralph. But no, I had to throw that in there. But Ralph, we appreciate you taking the time. And again, for anyone who's interested in connecting more, you can connect with Ralph on LinkedIn. The Crisis Leadership book is out, but we just encourage all of you to take some time for self-reflection, as I know it's helped Sean and I as well. So thank you, Ralph, for taking the time with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good luck, everyone.
All right.
Great. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you.